The old pickup truck wheezed to a stop at the end of the dusty driveway, black smoke curling from its exhaust pipe like a final surrender. Rachel Martinez sat behind the wheel for a long moment, her knuckles white against the cracked steering wheel, staring at the weathered ranch house that would either be her salvation or her final mistake. In the passenger seat, a tiny brown and white goat kid bleated softly, its impossibly long legs folded awkwardly, in a makeshift carrier fashioned from a cardboard box and old towels. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The classified ad had been simple enough. Housekeeper and cook needed for working cattle ranch. Room and board provided. Must be reliable and hardworking. No references required. Those last 4 words had sealed the deal. Rachel had exactly $73 to her name, a truck that wouldn't make it another 100 miles, and a baby goat she'd rescued from the side of the highway 3 days earlier when its mother had been struck by a semi. What she didn't have was references. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on the metal roof of her ancient Chevy, turning the cab into an oven despite the October date on the calendar. Rachel reached over and gently stroked the goat's head, earning a contented sigh from the little creature she'd named Hope during their 3-day journey from Oklahoma. Everything she owned was crammed into the truck bed and covered with a blue tarp that had seen better decades. 2 suitcases of clothes, a box of kitchen supplies she'd salvaged from her old life, and a coffee can containing her grandmother's recipe collection written on index cards yellowed with age and splattered with evidence of countless Sunday dinners. 6 months ago, Rachel had been Mrs. Rachel Hendricks, wife to James, mother to 7-year-old Sophie, and owner of a small but successful catering business that specialized in comfort food and wedding cakes. Her kitchen had been the heart of their modest home in Tulsa, always filled with the aroma of fresh bread or simmering soup, always welcoming to neighbors and friends who knew they could count on Rachel for a meal and a sympathetic ear. The accident had changed everything, in the space of a heartbeat. A drunk driver running a red light on a rainy Thursday evening, and suddenly Rachel's world had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. James and Sophie, returning from her daughter's piano lesson, never made it home. The piano keys Sophie had been so excited to show her mommy remained forever silent. For months afterward, Rachel had moved through her life like a ghost, haunting her own existence. Friends brought casseroles and offered help, but their kindness only emphasized the enormous void where her family used to be. The catering business faltered, as Rachel found herself unable to cook without breaking down in tears. How could she create celebration cakes for other people's joy when her own life had crumbled? The insurance money helped for a while, but medical bills from the extended hospital stay where she'd held Sophie's hand for those final 2 weeks had eaten through most of it. When the foreclosure notice arrived, Rachel had felt a strange sense of relief. The house held too many memories anyway. Sophie's drawing still covered the refrigerator. James's coffee mug still sat in the dish drainer where she'd placed it that last morning, never knowing it would be the last time she'd wash it for him. The bank could have it all. She needed to disappear, to find a place where no one knew her story, where she could exist without the weight of sympathy and the constant reminder of what she'd lost. The want ads in the Amarillo newspaper had been her lifeline. She'd driven south with no particular destination in mind, just away from everything familiar, when her truck had started making ominous noises outside a small diner. While waiting for the mechanic to deliver the bad news about her transmission, she'd picked up the local paper and found the ad for the Broken Arrow Ranch. Now, sitting in the driveway of what might be her last chance at a fresh start, Rachel wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. The ranch house was larger than she'd expected, but showed signs of neglect. Paint peeled from the wooden siding, and several shutters hung at odd angles. The wrap-around porch that might have once been welcoming was now cluttered with farm equipment, empty feed sacks, and what appeared to be several broken chairs. Beyond the house, she could see a large barn with a sagging roof and a series of corrals where dust devils danced in the afternoon heat. Hope bleated again, more insistently this time, and Rachel realized she couldn't sit in the truck forever. She gathered her courage, opened the driver's door, and stepped out into the oppressive heat. The air shimmered with waves of warmth rising from the baked earth, and she immediately felt sweat begin to bead on her forehead. The silence was profound after months of city noise, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the sparse grass that managed to survive in this harsh landscape. She lifted Hope from her makeshift carrier, and the little goat immediately began to explore the new environment with the boundless curiosity of youth. Rachel had fashioned a collar and leash from materials she'd found at a truck stop, though she wasn't entirely sure Hope would respect the constraints if something interesting caught her attention. The front door of the house opened before Rachel could decide whether to knock or call out an announcement of her arrival. The man who emerged was not what she'd expected. She'd imagined someone older, maybe weathered by years of ranch work, possibly gruff and set in his ways. Instead, she found herself looking at a man who couldn't be much older than her own 32 years. He was tall and lean, with the kind of build that spoke of physical work rather than gym sessions. His sandy brown hair was shorter than current fashion dictated, and his face was indeed weathered, but by sun and wind rather than age. What struck her most were his eyes. A deep green that held an expression of wariness mixed with something else she couldn't quite identify. He wore faded jeans, scuffed boots, and a blue chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. Everything about his appearance suggested a man who valued function over form, who dressed for work rather than appearance. He stepped onto the porch and let the screen door close behind him with a soft slap, his gaze moving from Rachel to the goat and back again. "You must be Rachel," he said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested Texas roots. "I'm Michael Rodriguez. We spoke on the phone." Rachel nodded, suddenly aware of how she must look after 3 days of driving, with minimal stops for proper meals or showers. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail that had seen better days, and her jeans and t-shirt bore evidence of her journey and her efforts to care for Hope along the way. "Yes, thank you for giving me the opportunity," she said, then glanced down at the goat, who was now investigating a cluster of chickens that had wandered over from somewhere behind the house. "I should explain about Hope. I found her on the highway. Her mother was killed by a truck, and she would have died if I'd left her there. I know it wasn't part of our arrangement, but I couldn't abandon her." Michael's expression remained neutral as he studied the small goat, but Rachel thought she detected a slight softening around his eyes. "She's a Nubian mix, looks like," he said. "Young enough that she'll need bottle feeding for a while yet." "I've been feeding her every few hours," Rachel said quickly, relieved that he hadn't immediately told her to get back in her truck. "I have formula and bottles, and I researched what she needs. I know it's an added complication, but she won't be any trouble. She's actually very well behaved. And she might even be useful eventually, for milk, or clearing brush, or whatever goats do on ranches." For the first time since she'd arrived, Michael smiled, a small expression that transformed his face entirely. "Goats on a cattle ranch are usually more trouble than they're worth," he said. "But we've got enough land that one more mouth to feed won't break us. Besides, she might be good company for you. It gets quiet out here." The relief that washed over Rachel was so intense it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She'd been prepared for rejection, for having to figure out what to do next with no money and a dying truck. Instead, she'd found acceptance, or at least tolerance. And that was more than she'd dared hope for. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was thick with emotion she tried to suppress. "I promise I'll work hard. I'm a good cook, and I don't mind cleaning or whatever else needs doing." Michael nodded and stepped down from the porch, moving with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his environment. "Let me help you get your things," he said, already walking toward her truck. "I'll show you to your room, and then we can go over what needs doing around here." As they unloaded her meager possessions, Rachel couldn't help but notice the condition of the ranch more closely. The house clearly needed work, but the bones of it were solid. The barn and corrals, while showing their age, were functional and well-maintained where it mattered for the animals. She could see cattle scattered across the pastures that stretched to the horizon, and the sight of them grazing peacefully in the late afternoon light was oddly comforting. "How long have you been running this place?" she asked as Michael carried one of her suitcases toward the house. "Inherited it from my uncle about 4 years ago," he replied. "He ran it with my aunt for 30 years, but when she passed, he couldn't manage alone anymore. Left it to me when he died." There was something in his tone that suggested the inheritance hadn't been entirely welcome, but Rachel didn't feel she knew him well enough to probe deeper. Everyone had their stories, and she was hardly in a position to judge anyone else's complications. The inside of the house was a revelation. While the exterior showed neglect, the interior had good bones. and retained much of its original charm. Hardwood floors stretched throughout the main living areas, scarred by years of use, but still beautiful. The furniture was sparse but sturdy, the kind of pieces built to last rather than to impress. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall of the living room, and Rachel could imagine how welcoming it would be during the cold months. The kitchen, however, told a different story. It was large and had obviously been designed by someone who understood cooking, with plenty of counter space and good natural light from windows that looked out over the back pasture. But it was also clearly the domain of a man who viewed cooking as a necessity rather than a pleasure. The counters were clean but bare, the cabinets held only the most basic supplies, and the refrigerator contained little more than beer, eggs, and leftovers from what appeared to be multiple takeout meals. "I should probably warn you," Michael said, seeming to notice her assessment of the kitchen. "I'm not much of a cook. Been living mostly on sandwiches and whatever the diner in town has left at the end of the day. That's one of the main reasons I placed the ad. A man can only eat so many frozen dinners before he starts to feel like he's forgotten what real food tastes like." Rachel nodded, already mentally cataloging what she would need to turn the kitchen into a functional heart of the home again. "I can work with this," she said. "It's a good kitchen. It just needs someone who cares about food to bring it back to life." Michael led her down a hallway to a bedroom that had obviously been prepared for her arrival. It was simple but clean, with a double bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade, a dresser, and a small desk positioned beneath a window that offered a view of the pasture. The walls were painted a soft yellow that made the room feel warm and welcoming despite its simplicity. "The bathroom is just across the hall," Michael said. "You'll have it to yourself. I used the one off the master bedroom." He paused, seeming suddenly awkward. "I should probably mention that it's just me here. The ranch hands who help during calving season and roundup have their own places in town. I hope that doesn't make you uncomfortable." Rachel appreciated his directness. "I'm grateful for the job," she said simply. "I'll respect your privacy and I trust you'll respect mine." Michael nodded, looking relieved that the potentially awkward conversation was over. "Dinner's usually around 6, he said. "Nothing fancy. I was planning on grilled cheese and soup from a can, but if you're up to cooking tonight, I won't complain." "I'd like that," Rachel said, and realized she meant it. For the first time in months, the prospect of cooking for someone else didn't fill her with dread. Maybe it was the distance from her old life, or maybe it was the simple fact that Michael didn't know her story and therefore couldn't look at her with pity or uncomfortable sympathy. Whatever the reason, she felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. After Michael left her to settle in, Rachel sat on the bed and looked around her new home. It wasn't much, but it was hers for now, and that was more than she'd had that morning. Through the window, she could see Hope exploring the area near the porch, apparently having made friends with the chickens who no longer seemed alarmed by her presence. She unpacked her few belongings, hanging her clothes in the small closet and arranging her toiletries in the bathroom. When she opened the box containing her grandmother's recipes, the familiar smell of vanilla and cinnamon that clung to the old cards brought tears to her eyes. For a moment, she was 8 years old again, standing on a step stool in her grandmother's kitchen, learning to measure flour and crack eggs without getting shell in the bowl. Those recipes had been her foundation when she'd started her catering business. Her grandmother's chocolate cake had been the star of dozens of weddings, her beef stew had comforted countless families during difficult times, and her biscuits had been legendary among Rachel's regular customers. Looking at the cards now, Rachel felt a flicker of the passion that had once driven her. Maybe here, in this place where no one knew her history, she could find her way back to the joy she'd once found in feeding people. The kitchen was better equipped than she'd first thought. Hidden in the back of cabinets, she found good pots and pans that had been well cared for, probably left by Michael's aunt. The pantry was sparse but contained the basics, and she was pleased to find a well-stocked spice rack that suggested someone in the past had taken cooking seriously. She decided to start simple for her first meal. Checking the refrigerator and freezer, she found ground beef that looked fresh, onions, potatoes, and frozen vegetables. Beef stew was comfort food, the kind of meal that filled a house with welcoming aromas and promised that everything might be okay. She pulled out her grandmother's recipe card, its corners soft with age, and its surface stained with evidence of decades of use. As she began to brown the meat, Rachel felt some of the tension she'd been carrying for months begin to ease. The familiar motions of cooking, the sizzle of beef hitting hot oil, the sharp scent of onions beginning to caramelize, all combined to create a meditation of sorts. For the first time since the accident, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost. Instead, she was focused on what she was creating. Hope had apparently grown tired of exploring and had made her way into the kitchen, where she settled herself in a sunny spot near the back door. Rachel had set up a bed for her using old towels, and the little goat seemed content to watch the cooking process with intelligent brown eyes. Every so often she would bleat softly, as if offering commentary on Rachel's technique. The stew was simmering nicely when Michael appeared in the kitchen doorway, drawn by aromas he probably hadn't experienced in his own home for months. He stood for a moment, just breathing in the smells of home-cooked food, and Rachel saw something in his expression that made her think he understood loss in his own way. "Smells incredible," he said, his voice holding a note of genuine appreciation. "I'd forgotten what it was like to come inside and smell dinner cooking." "It's just beef stew," Rachel said, but she was pleased by his reaction. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Nothing fancy, but it's filling, and it tastes like someone cares." Michael nodded, understanding passing between them without need for further explanation. "Is there anything I can do to help?" The question surprised Rachel. In her marriage, James had been supportive of her cooking career, but he'd rarely offered to help in the kitchen, viewing it as her domain. The offer of assistance from someone who was essentially her employer felt both unexpected and oddly touching. "You could set the table," she suggested, "and maybe check on Hope. She's been so good today, but she'll need another bottle soon." As Michael moved around the kitchen, setting out plates and silverware, Rachel was struck by how natural it felt to have another person sharing the space with her. There was none of the awkwardness she'd expected, none of the tension that might have existed between strangers. Instead, there was a quiet companionship that felt surprisingly comfortable. When they sat down to eat, the kitchen filled with the warm glow of the setting sun streaming through the windows. Rachel felt a sense of rightness she hadn't experienced in months. The stew was good, rich and savory, with tender meat and vegetables that had absorbed all the complex flavors of the broth. But more than that, it was the simple pleasure of sharing a meal with another person, of seeing appreciation for her work reflected in Michael's face as he ate. "This is the best meal I've had in months," Michael said, and Rachel could tell he meant it. "Maybe years. I'd forgotten that food could taste like this." "Cooking is about more than just following a recipe," Rachel said, echoing words her grandmother had told her long ago. "It's about putting care into what you're making, about feeding people in a way that nourishes more than just their bodies." Michael nodded thoughtfully. "My aunt used to say something similar. She was always cooking for someone, whether it was the ranch hands or neighbors or anyone who happened to stop by. This kitchen was the center of everything back then." "What happened to her?" Rachel asked gently. "Cancer," Michael said simply. "Took her fast, which was maybe a blessing in disguise. Uncle Pete was lost without her. He tried to keep going, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. The ranch started falling apart, and he couldn't seem to find his way back to caring about it." Rachel heard the unspoken grief in his voice and recognized it as something familiar. "It's hard to keep going when the person who made it all worthwhile is gone," she said quietly. Michael's green eyes met hers across the table, and she saw a flash of understanding, as if he'd heard something in her tone that resonated with his own experience. "Yeah," he said, "it is." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and when Rachel got up to clear the dishes, Michael helped without being asked. As they worked together to clean the kitchen, Hope wandered over to investigate, her small hooves clicking on the hardwood floor. Rachel heated a bottle of formula for her, and the little goat settled contentedly in her lap as she fed, her trust complete and touching. "She really has taken to you," Michael observed, sitting across from them at the kitchen table. "Most animals are pretty good judges of character." "Animals are easier than people sometimes," Rachel said, stroking Hope's soft fur. "They don't ask complicated questions or expect you to be something you're not." Michael was quiet for a long moment, watching her feed the goat. "Can I ask what brought you here?" he said finally. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, but there's something about the way you talk that makes me think you're running from something. Rachel looked up at him, considering how much to reveal. She'd come here to escape her story, but there was something about Michael's straightforward manner that made her want to be honest. I lost my family in a car accident 6 months ago, she said, her voice steady but quiet. My husband and 7-year-old daughter. I couldn't stay in Oklahoma anymore. Everything there reminded me of them, and I felt like I was drowning in other people's sympathy. Michael's expression grew serious, and she saw recognition in his eyes. I'm sorry, he said, and she could tell he meant it. That's a loss no one should have to bear. What about you? Rachel asked. There's something in your voice when you talk about your aunt and uncle that makes me think their deaths weren't your only experience with loss. Michael was quiet for so long that Rachel began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. I was married, he said. Sarah and I met in college. We had plans, you know. We're going to travel, maybe start a family, build a life together. Then she was diagnosed with leukemia 2 years after we got married. Rachel felt her heart clench with sympathy. How long did she fight? 3 years, Michael said. 3 years of treatments and hope and watching her get sicker. She died just before my uncle left me the ranch. I think that's why he did it, actually. He knew I needed somewhere to go, something to focus on besides grief. They sat in the gathering darkness of the kitchen, two people who had found each other in the aftermath of devastating loss. Hope had finished her bottle and was sleeping peacefully in Rachel's lap, her breathing soft and even. Outside, the sounds of the ranch at evening could be heard. Cattle settling for the night, the distant call of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the sparse grass. I should probably get her settled for the night, Rachel said finally, gently lifting the sleeping goat. And I should probably get some rest myself. Tomorrow I'd like to take a better look at the kitchen, see what supplies we need to stock up on. Michael nodded and stood as well. The nearest grocery store is in town, about 20 miles north. I usually go once a week. We can make a list tomorrow, and I'll take you with me so you can get whatever you need. Thank you, Rachel said, for everything. For giving me this chance, for accepting hope, for sharing your story with me. I know it's not easy to talk about. Michael met her eyes, and she saw a hint of the same relief she felt at having found someone who understood. Thank you for listening, he said, and for the best meal I've had in longer than I care to admit. As Rachel settled Hope in her improvised bed in the corner of her room, she reflected on the unexpected turn her day had taken. This morning, she'd been desperate, nearly broke, with nowhere to go and no idea what would happen next. Now she had a roof over her head, work that felt meaningful, and the beginning of what might become a friendship with someone who understood grief in a way most people never could. Looking out her bedroom window at the vast expanse of Texas sky, brilliant with stars in a way she'd never seen in the city, Rachel felt something she hadn't experienced in months. It wasn't happiness exactly, not yet. But it was possibility, the sense that maybe, just maybe, she could build something new from the ashes of what she'd lost. Hope stirred in her sleep, making a small, contented sound, and Rachel smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new adjustments to this unfamiliar life. But tonight, for the first time since the accident, she felt like she might actually be able to sleep peacefully. The ranch was quiet around her, but it was a comfortable quiet, full of the sounds of life continuing in its ancient rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly to each other. The wind whispered through the eaves of the old house. And in the kitchen below, the lingering aromas of dinner spoke of nourishment and care, and the possibility of home. Rachel closed her eyes and let herself imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to belong somewhere again. The thought was terrifying and hopeful in equal measure, but for the first time in months, she wasn't afraid to hope. The morning sun painted the Texas landscape in shades of gold and amber. As Rachel made her way to the kitchen at 5:30, Hope trotting beside her on unsteady legs. The little goat had woken her with soft bleating, hungry for her morning bottle, and Rachel found herself grateful for the early start. She'd always been an early riser, but since the accident, sleep had become elusive, filled with dreams that left her feeling more exhausted than when she'd gone to bed. The kitchen was empty and quiet, bathed in the soft light filtering through the east-facing windows. Rachel set about preparing Hope's bottle, warming the formula to just the right temperature while the little goat explored the corners of the room with endless curiosity. There was something deeply satisfying about this simple morning routine. The weight of the small creature in her arms as she fed her, the trust and contentment in Hope's brown eyes. As Hope finished her bottle, Rachel heard the sound of boots on the back porch and the creak of the screen door. Michael appeared in the doorway, his hair damp from a shower and his clothes fresh, though he already looked like he'd been up for hours. Ranch life, she was learning, started early and ended late. "Morning," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "How did you both sleep?" "Better than I have in months," Rachel admitted, settling Hope on the floor where she immediately began investigating a patch of sunlight. "The quiet takes some getting used to, but it's a good kind of quiet." Michael nodded, moving to the coffee pot with the practiced efficiency of someone who needed caffeine to function. "Coffee's about the only thing I can manage in the kitchen without burning down the house," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "But I make it strong enough to wake the dead." "I can cook breakfast if you'd like," Rachel offered, already mentally cataloging the ingredients she'd seen in the refrigerator the night before. "I'm an early riser anyway, and I enjoy cooking in the morning when everything's peaceful." "I usually just grab something in town on my way to the feed store," Michael said. But she could hear the uncertainty in his voice, as if he was torn between habit and the prospect of a home-cooked meal. "It's no trouble," Rachel assured him. "Besides, I need to start earning my keep around here. What do you normally have for breakfast?" Michael poured coffee into 2 mugs and handed one to her. "Whatever's fastest," he said. "Usually just coffee and whatever's left from dinner the night before, if anything." Rachel shook her head, appalled by the idea of starting the day with nothing more substantial than caffeine. "A working man needs proper fuel," she said, echoing something her grandmother used to tell her grandfather every morning of their 50-year marriage, especially someone who spends his days doing physical labor. She moved around the kitchen with growing confidence, pulling out ingredients and assessing what she had to work with. The pantry yielded flour, baking powder, and salt, while the refrigerator provided eggs, milk, and butter. It had been months since she'd made biscuits from scratch, but her hands remembered the movements even when her mind faltered. "What are you making?" Michael asked, settling at the kitchen table with his coffee and watching her work with obvious interest. "Biscuits and gravy," Rachel said, measuring flour into a large bowl. "My grandmother's recipe. She used to say that no one should face the day on an empty stomach, and that biscuits were the foundation of any decent breakfast." As she worked, cutting butter into the flour mixture with practiced strokes, Rachel felt the familiar rhythm of baking settle over her. There was something meditative about the process, the precise measurements and careful techniques that had been passed down through generations of women in her family. For a moment, she could almost feel her grandmother's presence beside her, guiding her hands and whispering encouragement. Michael watched her work with fascination, as if he'd never seen someone cook from scratch before. "My aunt used to make biscuits," he said quietly, "every Sunday morning, without fail. The smell would wake me up when I was a kid and came to visit during summers." "Did she teach you how?" Rachel asked, rolling out the dough on the floured counter. Michael shook his head. "I was always too busy with ranch work or too eager to get outside to pay attention to what she was doing in the kitchen. I wish now that I'd learned. After she died, I realized how much I'd taken for granted." Rachel understood that particular regret intimately. "I felt the same way about my daughter," she said, her voice growing soft. "I was always so focused on building my business, on making sure we had enough money saved for her college fund and family vacations. I kept thinking there would be time later to teach her all my grandmother's recipes, to pass down the family traditions. But there wasn't time later." She paused in her work, her hands stilling on the rolling pin as the familiar wave of grief washed over her. Even after 6 months, the reality of Sophie's absence could still hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and threatening to buckle her knees. Michael was quiet for a long moment, seeming to understand that she needed space to process the emotion. When he spoke again, his voice was gentle. "What was she like? Your daughter?" Rachel smiled despite the tears that threatened to spill over. "Curious about everything," she said, returning to cutting the biscuits with steady movements. She wanted to know how things worked, why people did the things they did, what would happen if you mixed all the colors of paint together. She was fearless in the way that only children can be, convinced that the world was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. "She sounds like she was amazing," Michael said, and Rachel could hear the genuine warmth in his voice. "She was," Rachel agreed, sliding the biscuits into the preheated oven. She would have loved Hope. She was always bringing home stray animals, convinced she could heal anything with enough love and attention. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Hope wandered over to investigate the wonderful smells emanating from the oven. She'd grown bolder overnight, exploring more of the kitchen, and even attempting to climb onto one of the chairs, though her legs were still too short to manage the feat successfully. Rachel started on the sausage gravy while the biscuits baked, browning the meat and building the roux with the careful attention to detail that separated good cooking from great cooking. The kitchen filled with the rich aromas of breakfast, and she saw Michael's expression change as the familiar smells awakened memories and hunger in equal measure. "I haven't smelled anything like this since I was a kid," he said, standing to refill his coffee and moving closer to where she worked at the stove. "Are you sure you're not some kind of wizard?" Rachel laughed, the first genuine laughter she'd felt in months bubbling up from somewhere deep inside her. "Just years of practice," she said, "and a grandmother who believed that cooking was an act of love." When the biscuits emerged from the oven, golden brown and perfectly risen, Michael let out a low whistle of appreciation. Rachel split them open, the steam escaping in fragrant clouds, and ladled the creamy sausage gravy over them with generous portions. They sat at the kitchen table as the sun climbed higher in the sky, eating in companionable silence broken only by Michael's occasional murmurs of appreciation. The biscuits were everything Rachel had hoped they would be, light and fluffy with a tender crumb that soaked up the rich gravy perfectly. For the first time since the accident, she felt a sense of pride in her cooking, a connection to the skills and traditions that had once defined her. "This is incredible," Michael said, finishing his second helping and looking longingly at the remaining biscuits. "I'd forgotten that food could taste like this. You're going to spoil me completely." "That's the idea," Rachel said, pleased by his obvious enjoyment. "A well-fed rancher is a happy rancher, and a happy employer makes for a better working relationship." Michael smiled, and she realized it was the first truly relaxed expression she'd seen on his face since her arrival. "I think this arrangement is going to work out better than either of us expected," he said. After breakfast, Michael took her on a proper tour of the ranch, explaining the layout of the property and introducing her to the daily routines that kept everything running smoothly. The Broken Arrow Ranch was larger than Rachel had initially realized, encompassing several thousand acres of pasture and cropland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The cattle were beautiful animals, mostly Black Angus with a few Herefords mixed in, grazing peacefully in pastures that seemed to go on forever. Michael explained the breeding program, the seasonal routines of calving and weaning, and the delicate balance of managing grassland to ensure the animals had adequate nutrition year-round. "Most people think ranching is just a matter of turning cattle loose and letting them fend for themselves," he said as they walked along a fence line, checking for damage or wear. "But there's a lot more science to it than that. Soil management, nutrition, genetics, weather patterns, market timing. My uncle spent 40 years learning how to do it right." "And you're learning from him?" Rachel asked, impressed by the obvious complexity of the operation. "Trying to," Michael said. He left detailed records, and some of the neighboring ranchers have been helpful when I've had questions, but there's a lot I'm still figuring out as I go. Rachel could hear the uncertainty in his voice, the weight of responsibility for something he'd never planned to inherit. "It must be overwhelming sometimes," she said. "Taking on something this big when you're still grieving." Michael nodded, stopping to examine a loose wire in the fence. "Some days I wonder if I'm doing right by Uncle Pete's legacy," he admitted. "He and Aunt Maria built this place from nothing, turned it into something successful and sustainable. I'm terrified I'm going to screw it up." "But you're here," Rachel pointed out. "You could have sold it, walked away, found something easier. Instead, you're learning, working, to maintain what they built. That says something about your character." Michael looked at her with surprise, as if the thought hadn't occurred to him before. "I never thought of it that way," he said. Mostly I just feel like I'm stumbling around in the dark, hoping I don't make any catastrophic mistakes. We're all stumbling around in the dark to some degree, Rachel said. The trick is to keep moving forward anyway. They spent the morning walking the property, and Rachel found herself genuinely interested in learning about ranch operations. There was something appealing about the rhythm of agricultural life, the way everything was connected to the seasons and the land, the satisfaction that came from working with animals and growing things. Hope had accompanied them on their tour, sometimes walking on her leash, and sometimes riding in Rachel's arms when the little goat grew tired. She seemed fascinated by the cattle, though she maintained a respectful distance from the much larger animals. The chickens, however, had become her particular friends, and she followed them around their pen with obvious delight. By lunchtime, Rachel was feeling more optimistic about her new situation than she had dared to hope. The work was different from anything she'd done before, but it was honest work in a beautiful setting, with an employer who seemed genuinely decent and kind. "I should probably head into town this afternoon," Michael said as they returned to the house. "Need to pick up some supplies from the feed store and check in with the vet about the breeding schedule. You're welcome to come along if you want to get familiar with the area." Rachel accepted the invitation, curious to see the town that would presumably become her local community. Pine Ridge was about 20 miles north of the ranch, a typical small Texas town, with a main street lined with brick storefronts and tree-shaded neighborhoods spreading out from the commercial center. The feed store was their first stop, a large metal building filled with every conceivable supply a rancher might need. Rachel wandered the aisles while Michael conducted his business, amazed by the variety of specialized equipment and products required to run a successful agricultural operation. "You must be the new housekeeper out at the Rodriguez place," said a voice behind her, and Rachel turned to find a woman about her own age, with short blonde hair and friendly eyes. "I'm Jenny Patterson. My husband and I run the hardware store down the street." "Rachel Martinez," she replied, wondering how quickly word traveled in small towns. "Yes, I just started working for Michael yesterday." "Well, welcome to Pine Ridge," Jenny said warmly. "It's a good town, and Michael's good people. He's had a rough time of it the last few years, but he's got a good heart. Are you settling in okay?" "Very well, thank you," Rachel said, touched by the woman's friendliness. "It's quite an adjustment from city life, but it's beautiful country out there." "Where are you from originally?" Jenny asked, and Rachel found herself giving the abbreviated version of her story, mentioning Oklahoma but not the details of why she'd left. "Well, if you need anything, or just want some female company sometime, feel free to stop by the hardware store," Jenny said. "We don't get many new faces around here, especially young women. It'll be nice to have someone new to talk to." Rachel thanked her for the offer, genuinely touched by the warm welcome. In the city, neighbors often live side by side for years without more than passing greetings, but there was something different about small-town hospitality that felt both foreign and appealing. Their next stop was the grocery store, where Rachel was delighted to find a well-stocked butcher shop and a produce section that, while limited, offered fresh vegetables and fruits. She made a mental list of ingredients for the meals she was planning, thinking ahead to the kinds of hearty, satisfying food that would fuel a working rancher. "What are you thinking?" Michael asked, watching her examine the selection of beef cuts with a practiced eye. "Pot roast for tomorrow night," Rachel said, "something that can simmer all day while we're working, and that will make the house smell like home. And maybe I'll try my hand at some bread to go with it." "Homemade bread?" Michael asked, his expression brightening considerably. "I haven't had homemade bread since Aunt Maria died." Rachel smiled at his obvious enthusiasm. "It's actually not difficult, just time-consuming, but there's nothing quite like fresh bread with real butter." As they loaded their groceries into Michael's truck, Rachel felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life for months. She had work to do, meals to plan, someone to feed who appreciated her efforts. It wasn't the life she'd planned, but it was a life, and for now, that felt like enough. The drive back to the ranch took them through countryside that grew more beautiful as the afternoon light slanted across the rolling hills. Rachel found herself really seeing the landscape for the first time, noticing the way the grass moved in the wind, the scattered live oak trees that provided shade for the cattle, the endless expanse of sky that seemed to go on forever. "It grows on you," Michael said, noticing her obvious appreciation for the scenery. "When I first got here, all I could see was how isolated it was, how far from civilization. But after a while, you start to see the beauty and the emptiness." "It's peaceful," Rachel said. "After months of feeling like I was drowning in noise and chaos, this feels like I can finally breathe again." They spent the rest of the afternoon working together on various ranch tasks. Michael showed Rachel how to check the water troughs, how to spot signs of illness or injury in the cattle, and how to maintain the equipment that kept everything running smoothly. She proved to be a quick learner, asking intelligent questions and demonstrating the kind of practical common sense that made ranch work easier. Hope had claimed a place in the barn, where she'd discovered a pile of hay that made an excellent bed and playground. She seemed to have an instinctive understanding of farm life, staying out of the way when necessary but always curious about the activities going on around her. As evening approached, Rachel began preparing dinner, seasoning the pot roast she'd bought in town and setting it to brown in a large Dutch oven. The kitchen filled with the rich aromas of searing meat and onions, and she found herself humming softly as she worked, something she hadn't done since before the accident. "You look happy," Michael observed, settling at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and watching her cook. Rachel paused to consider the observation. "I don't know if happy is the right word," she said slowly, "but I feel useful again, like I have a purpose. For months, I felt like I was just going through the motions of living without any real reason to get up in the morning." "I understand that feeling," Michael said quietly. "After Sarah died, I went through months where everything felt pointless. Work, eating, sleeping, talking to people. It all seemed like an elaborate pretense that life was still worth living." "What changed?" Rachel asked, genuinely curious about his path through grief. Michael was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. "Honestly, I think it was this place," he said finally. "Uncle Pete needed help, and then he died and left me the ranch, and suddenly I had all these animals depending on me. I couldn't afford to wallow in grief anymore because there were cattle to feed and fences to repair and a dozen other things that wouldn't wait for me to figure out how to be happy again." Rachel nodded, understanding the healing power of necessity, of having something outside yourself that required attention and care. "Sometimes I think that's the only way through grief," she said, "not around it or over it, but straight through the middle, one day at a time." "Exactly," Michael said. "And some days are better than others, but you keep going because you don't really have any other choice." They ate dinner by the light of the setting sun, the pot roast tender and flavorful, accompanied by roasted vegetables and fresh bread that Rachel had managed to bake despite the kitchen's somewhat temperamental oven. Michael's appreciation was evident in every bite, and Rachel felt a deep satisfaction in providing nourishment and comfort through her cooking. After dinner, they sat on the front porch as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared. Hope had claimed a spot between them, dozing contentedly after her evening bottle. The night air was cool and fresh, carrying the sounds of cattle settling for sleep and the distant call of coyotes in the hills. "This is nice," Michael said, his voice soft in the gathering darkness. "I haven't sat out here in months. Used to be one of my favorite things about this place." "Why did you stop?" Rachel asked. Michael was quiet for a long moment. "It reminded me too much of evenings with Sarah," he said finally. "We used to talk about sitting on a porch like this when we got old, watching sunsets and counting stars. After she died, it hurt too much to sit here alone." Rachel understood the way grief could turn comfort into torture, making beloved places and cherished routines unbearable. "Maybe it's different when you're not alone," she suggested gently. "Maybe it is," Michael agreed, and she heard something like hope in his voice. As the night deepened around them, Rachel felt a sense of contentment that surprised her with its intensity. This wasn't the life she'd planned, wasn't the future she'd dreamed of with James and Sophie. But it was a life, and it was hers, and for the first time in months, that felt like enough. The next morning brought their first real test. Rachel woke before dawn, as had become her habit, and made her way to the kitchen to prepare Hope's bottle and start breakfast. She'd planned to try her hand at biscuits again, having been pleased with yesterday's success, but something went wrong almost immediately. Whether it was the altitude, the different flour, or simply an off day, the biscuits that emerged from the oven were nothing like the golden, fluffy perfection of the day before. They were flat, hard, and distinctly burned around the edges despite her careful timing. The smell of charred bread filled the kitchen, and Rachel stared at the ruined batch with dismay. Michael appeared in the doorway just as she was pulling the burnt offerings from the oven, and she saw his face fall as he took in the situation. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Rachel felt the weight of failure settle over her like a heavy blanket. "Well," she said finally, trying to keep her voice light despite her embarrassment. "I guess yesterday was beginner's luck." Michael looked at the blackened biscuits, then at her stricken face, and something shifted in his expression. Instead of disappointment or criticism, she saw understanding, maybe even sympathy. "You know what?" he said, moving to stand beside her at the counter. "I've been living on burnt toast and overcooked eggs for months. At least your burned biscuits were made with care." Rachel looked up at him, surprised by his kindness in the face of her obvious failure. "You don't have to be nice about it," she said. "They're terrible. I don't know what went wrong." "Everyone has off days," Michael said simply. "Besides, the coffee's still good, and I saw eggs in the refrigerator. We'll make do." But Rachel was already moving, her competitive nature and professional pride refusing to accept defeat. "No," she said, pulling out the flour and baking powder again. "I can do better than this. Give me 20 minutes, and I'll show you what those biscuits were supposed to taste like." Michael looked like he wanted to protest, to tell her it wasn't necessary, but something in her expression must have warned him not to argue. Instead, he refilled his coffee cup and settled at the table to watch her work. The second batch was a disaster too, though in a different way. This time, she overcompensated for the previous mistakes, and the biscuits came out pale and gummy, barely cooked through despite the extended baking time. Rachel stared at them with growing frustration, unable to understand what she was doing wrong. "Maybe the oven runs hot," Michael suggested diplomatically, but Rachel was already starting on batch number 3. "My grandmother made perfect biscuits every morning for 50 years, she said, her voice tight with determination. "I've been making biscuits since I was 12 years old. I am not going to be defeated by a simple batch of breakfast bread." The third attempt was better, though still not up to her usual standards. The biscuits were edible, even reasonably good, but they lacked the perfection she'd achieved the day before. Rachel looked at them with mixed feelings, proud that she'd persevered, but frustrated by her inability to replicate her earlier success. "These look great," Michael said, though she could hear the careful diplomacy in his voice. "They're adequate," Rachel said with a sigh, splitting them open and buttering them with perhaps more force than was strictly necessary. "But adequate isn't good enough. I have a reputation to maintain." Michael smiled at her fierce determination, and Rachel realized she was being a bit ridiculous about what were, after all, just biscuits. But cooking had been her identity for so long, the one thing she'd always been able to count on, that failure in the kitchen felt like a personal attack on her very sense of self. "You know," Michael said as they ate the perfectly serviceable if not perfect biscuits, "yesterday was pretty impressive, but today is more reassuring." Rachel looked at him with confusion. "How is failure reassuring?" "Because it proves you're human," Michael said with a gentle smile. "Yesterday was so perfect it was almost intimidating. Like maybe you were too good to be true. Today proves you're real, that you struggle with things like the rest of us." Rachel felt something warm unfold in her chest at his words, a recognition that he wasn't looking for perfection from her, wasn't expecting her to be anything other than exactly who she was. It was a gift she hadn't even realized she needed. Acceptance of her flaws and failures alongside her strengths. "Besides," Michael added, taking another bite of biscuit, "these are still better than anything I could make, and the company makes even burnt biscuits taste better." Rachel smiled then, really smiled, for the first time since she'd walked into the kitchen that morning. "Thank you," she said, "for not making me feel like a complete failure." "We all have days when nothing goes right," Michael said. "The measure of a person isn't whether they fail, it's how they handle the failure." As they finished breakfast and prepared to start their daily work, Rachel reflected on the morning's lesson. She'd come to the ranch hoping to find a place where she could disappear, where no one would expect anything from her or judge her struggles. Instead, she'd found something better. Someone who saw her failures and chose to be kind anyway, who valued her efforts even when they fell short of perfection. It was, she thought, a better foundation for building a new life than she could have hoped for. 3 weeks into October, the first cold snap hit Pine Ridge with unexpected ferocity. Rachel woke to frost covering the windows and Hope shivering despite the blankets she'd wrapped around the little goat's makeshift bed. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight, and the wind howled around the corners of the old house like a living thing seeking entry. She pulled on her warmest sweater and hurried to the kitchen, where she found Michael already building a fire in the old wood stove that supplemented the house's heating system. His movements were efficient but tense, and she could see worry lines creasing his forehead. "Cattle okay?" she asked, understanding instinctively that his concern was for the animals scattered across the vast pastures. "Most of them should be fine," Michael said, adjusting the damper on the stove. "But we've got about 20 head in the north pasture that don't have adequate windbreak. I need to get out there and move them to the shelter near the barn." Rachel nodded, already moving to start coffee and prepare something hot for him to take along. "How can I help?" "Keep the home fires burning," Michael said with a grateful smile, "and maybe have something warm waiting when I get back. This could take most of the morning." After Michael left, bundled in layers and carrying a thermos of coffee, Rachel found herself alone in the big house for the first time since her arrival. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but expectant, as if the house itself was holding its breath waiting for his return. Hope had recovered from her morning chill and was exploring the kitchen with renewed energy, her small hooves clicking against the hardwood floors as she investigated every corner. Rachel had been gradually introducing her to small amounts of hay and grain, and the little goat was thriving under her care, growing stronger and more confident each day. As the morning wore on, Rachel found herself watching the windows anxiously, straining to catch sight of Michael returning from the north pasture. She knew he was experienced and capable, but the stories she'd heard about ranchers getting caught in sudden weather changes worried her more than she wanted to admit. She decided to channel her nervous energy into cooking, preparing a hearty stew that would warm him from the inside out when he finally made it home. The familiar rhythms of chopping vegetables and browning meat helped calm her mind, though she found herself glancing toward the windows every few minutes. It was nearly noon when she finally spotted his truck bouncing across the pasture, moving slowly but steadily toward the house. Relief flooded through her as she watched him park near the barn and climb stiffly from the driver's seat. Even from a distance, she could see the exhaustion in his movements, the way he paused to gather himself before walking toward the house. "Successful mission?" she asked as he stamped his boots on the porch and pushed through the door, bringing a rush of cold air with him. "All accounted for," Michael said, pulling off his gloves and flexing his fingers to restore circulation. "Though I think I left feeling in my toes somewhere out in that north pasture." Rachel was already moving, helping him out of his heavy coat and guiding him toward the kitchen, where the wood stove radiated blessed warmth. She poured him coffee and ladled steaming stew into a bowl, setting it before him with fresh bread she'd baked that morning. "You're an angel," Michael said, wrapping his hands around the warm bowl and breathing in the rich aroma. "I was starting to think I might turn into a human icicle out there." "Just doing my job," Rachel said, but she felt a warm glow of satisfaction at being able to provide comfort and nourishment when he needed it most. Michael ate with the focused intensity of a man who'd spent hours fighting cold wind and stubborn cattle. But she noticed him watching her as she moved around the kitchen, tidying up and preparing ingredients for dinner. There was something different in his expression, a thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before. "Rachel," he said suddenly, setting down his spoon. "Can I ask you something?" She looked up from the carrots she was peeling, noting the serious tone in his voice. "Of course." "Why did you really come here?" he asked. "I mean, I know about your husband and daughter, and I understand wanting to get away from painful memories. But you could have gone anywhere, done anything. Why answer an ad for a job on a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere?" Rachel set down her knife and considered the question. She'd been asking herself the same thing lately, wondering what had drawn her to this particular refuge when there had been so many other possibilities. "I think I was looking for something real," she said finally. "After the accident, everything in my old life felt fake somehow. People saying the right things but not meaning them, going through motions that didn't matter anymore. When I read your ad, it sounded honest. Like actual work that would make a difference, even if it was just making sure one rancher ate decent meals." Michael nodded slowly, as if her answer made sense to him. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," he said. "About what's real and what's just going through the motions. What conclusion have you reached?" Rachel asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "That this is real," Michael said, gesturing around the warm kitchen. Coming home to the smell of cooking food. Having someone to talk to at the end of the day. Caring whether someone else is warm and fed and safe. I'd forgotten what that felt like. There was something in his voice that made Rachel's heart beat a little faster. A vulnerability that spoke of deeper feelings than mere employer satisfaction. She found herself unable to look away from his green eyes, seeing something there that both thrilled and terrified her. "Michael," she began, not sure what she was going to say, when Hope chose that moment to bleat loudly from her corner of the kitchen, breaking the spell that had settled over them. They both laughed, the tension easing as Rachel moved to check on the little goat who was showing signs of wanting another bottle. The moment passed, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that were growing stronger, despite their best efforts to keep things simple. The weather stayed cold for several more days, trapping them together in the house more than usual, as Michael caught up on indoor maintenance tasks, and Rachel organized the kitchen and pantry to her satisfaction. They fell into an easy domestic rhythm that felt both natural and dangerous, too comfortable for the good of either of their carefully guarded hearts. It was during one of these enforced indoor days that Rachel decided to tackle the ambitious project of making homemade pasta, something she hadn't attempted since before the accident. The kitchen was warm from the wood stove, and Hope was napping peacefully in her favorite sunny corner, creating the perfect atmosphere for an afternoon of cooking. Rachel had found an old pasta machine tucked away in one of the kitchen cabinets, probably left behind by Michael's aunt, and she was determined to put it to good use. She made a well of flour on the wooden counter, cracked eggs into the center, and began the meditative process of bringing the dough together. Michael wandered into the kitchen as she was rolling out long sheets of golden pasta, hanging them over a makeshift drying rack she'd constructed from kitchen chairs and wooden spoons. "That's beautiful," he said, watching her work with obvious admiration. "I've never seen anyone make pasta from scratch." "It's actually quite simple," Rachel said, pleased by his interest. "Just flour, eggs, and patience. My grandmother used to make it every Sunday when I was growing up. She said store-bought pasta was fine for weekdays, but Sunday dinner deserved something made with love." "Will you teach me?" Michael asked, surprising her with the request. "You want to learn to make pasta?" Rachel asked, amused by the idea of this tough rancher wrestling with delicate sheets of dough. "I want to learn whatever you're willing to teach," Michael said, his voice serious. "I'm tired of being helpless in my own kitchen." So Rachel found herself guiding Michael through the process, standing close enough to smell the clean scent of his soap and feel the warmth radiating from his body. His hands were larger than hers, roughened by ranch work, but he proved surprisingly gentle with the delicate dough, following her instructions with careful attention. "Like this?" he asked, attempting to roll a sheet through the pasta machine, and Rachel moved behind him to adjust his technique, her hands covering his on the machine's handle. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through her that had nothing to do with the cool weather outside. She was intensely aware of his closeness, of the way he went very still when she touched him, as if he felt the same unexpected spark. "Perfect," she said, her voice coming out slightly breathless as she stepped back to give him space. "You're a natural." Michael turned to look at her, and she saw her own awareness reflected in his eyes. For a moment, they stood, frozen, the air between them charged with possibility and want, and the terrifying prospect of risking their hearts again. "Rachel," Michael said softly, and she heard everything he couldn't say in the way he spoke her name. Before either of them could decide what to do with the moment, the sound of a truck in the driveway broke through their suspended animation. Michael moved to the window, and Rachel saw his expression change from soft warmth to puzzled concern. "Were you expecting anyone?" she asked, moving to stand beside him at the window. "No," Michael said, watching as a woman climbed from the driver's seat of a dusty pickup truck. "But I know who that is." The woman approaching the house was tall and confident, with shoulder-length brown hair and the kind of easy stride that spoke of someone comfortable in rural settings. She wore jeans, boots, and a heavy jacket that looked both practical and expensive. "Diana Prescott," Michael said by way of explanation. "She runs the neighboring ranch to the east. We went to high school together." Rachel watched the woman climb the porch steps and felt an unexpected stab of something that might have been jealousy. There was something about the way Diana moved, the confidence with which she approached the house, that suggested a familiarity with both the place and the man who owned it. Michael opened the door before Diana could knock, and Rachel saw the warm smile that spread across the other woman's face at the sight of him. "Michael Rodriguez," Diana said, stepping into the warmth of the kitchen without waiting for an invitation. "I was driving by and saw smoke from your chimney. Figured I'd stop and see how you're weathering this cold snap." "Doing fine," Michael said, though Rachel noticed a certain stiffness in his posture that hadn't been there moments before. "Diana, this is Rachel Martinez. She's been helping me get the house back in order." Rachel, Diana runs the Triple P Ranch. Diana's assessing gaze swept over Rachel, taking in the flour-dusted apron, the pasta hanging to dry, and the obvious domesticity of the scene. Her smile never wavered, but Rachel saw something calculating in her eyes. "How wonderful," Diana said warmly. "It's about time someone brought some life back to this kitchen. Maria would be so pleased to see it being used properly again." There was something in the way she said it that suggested ownership, as if she had some claim to opinions about Michael's household arrangements. Rachel felt herself bristling despite her efforts to remain neutral. "Would you like some coffee?" Rachel offered, falling back on the reflexive hospitality her grandmother had drilled into her. "That would be lovely," Diana said, settling herself at the kitchen table as if she belonged there. "Michael, you look wonderful." Ranch life is obviously agreeing with you. As Rachel prepared coffee, she found herself listening to the conversation between Michael and Diana with growing unease. There was a history between them, that much was clear, and Diana seemed determined to remind Michael of their shared past at every opportunity. "Do you remember that winter when we were seniors?" Diana was saying, her voice warm with nostalgia. "When the power went out for 3 days and we all ended up at your uncle's place playing cards by lamplight?" "I remember," Michael said, though his responses seemed carefully neutral. "Those were good times," Diana continued. "Simple times, before everything got so complicated." Rachel set coffee cups before both of them, feeling increasingly like an intruder in what was clearly a private conversation loaded with subtext she didn't understand. She considered retreating to her room, giving them privacy to catch up, but something stubborn in her nature refused to be driven from her own kitchen. "So," Diana said, turning her attention to Rachel with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "how are you finding ranch life? It must be quite an adjustment from whatever you did before." "I'm finding it very rewarding," Rachel said carefully. "The work is different from what I'm used to, but Michael's been very patient in teaching me what I need to know." "And what did you do before?" Diana asked, her tone conversational but her eyes sharp with curiosity. "I had a catering business," Rachel said, immediately regretting the admission when she saw Diana's expression brighten with interest. "How fascinating," Diana said. "What brought you to ranch work? Surely catering would be more lucrative than cooking for one person in the middle of nowhere." The question was asked with apparent innocence, but Rachel heard the underlying implication clearly. What was someone with professional cooking skills doing taking such a humble position unless there was something she was running from? "Sometimes a change of scenery is worth more than money," Rachel said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. "Of course," Diana said agreeably. "We all need fresh starts sometimes." Michael had been watching this exchange with growing tension, and Rachel saw him make a visible effort to redirect the conversation. "How are things at the Triple P?" he asked. "I heard you were expanding the operation." "Doing well," Diana said, clearly pleased to have his attention. "Actually, that's part of why I stopped by. I've been thinking about what we discussed last month, about potentially combining some of our grazing lands during the winter months. The offer is still open if you're interested." Rachel saw something pass between them, some understanding or prior conversation that she wasn't privy to. The feeling of being excluded from something important in Michael's life was uncomfortable and unwelcome. "I'm still considering it," Michael said diplomatically. "Well, don't consider too long," Diana said with a laugh. "Good business opportunities don't wait forever. Besides, it would be nice to have an excuse to see more of you." The flirtation in her voice was unmistakable, and Rachel felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and something else she didn't want to examine too closely. She turned back to her pasta making, focusing on the mechanical task of cutting fettuccine strips with more attention than the simple job required. Diana stayed for another hour, monopolizing Michael's attention with talk of ranch business and shared memories that clearly excluded Rachel from the conversation. By the time she finally left, promising to call about the grazing arrangement, Rachel felt emotionally exhausted and strangely defeated. "I should probably finish getting dinner started," she said after Diana's truck had disappeared down the driveway, her voice carefully neutral. "Rachel?" Michael began, but she was already moving away from him, busying herself with preparations for the meal. "It's fine," she said quickly. "I know you have business relationships to maintain. I didn't mean to intrude on your conversation." "You weren't intruding," Michael said firmly. "This is your home too, at least for now." The qualification stung more than Rachel wanted to admit. For now, as if her presence here was temporary, conditional, subject to change when something better came along. They ate dinner in relative silence, the easy companionship of earlier in the day replaced by an awkwardness that neither seemed able to bridge. Rachel found herself wondering about Michael's relationship with Diana, about the business opportunity that seemed to involve more than simple ranch management, about her own presumptions in thinking she'd found something special in this isolated place. That night, unable to sleep, Rachel found herself on the front porch despite the cold air, Hope curled in her lap and a blanket wrapped around both of them. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, but their beauty felt distant and cold. She heard the screen door open behind her and knew without looking that Michael had joined her. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked, settling into the chair beside hers. "Too much on my mind," Rachel admitted. They sat in silence for several minutes before Michael spoke again. "Diana and I dated in high school," he said quietly. "And again briefly after Sarah died. It didn't work out." Rachel felt her heart clench at this confirmation of what she'd suspected. "You don't owe me any explanations," she said, though part of her was grateful for the honesty. "I think I do," Michael said. "Because what happened between us this afternoon, before she arrived, that meant something to me. And I don't want you thinking it didn't, just because someone from my past showed up and complicated things." Rachel looked at him then, seeing sincerity and something deeper in his expression. "What are you saying, Michael?" "I'm saying that I've been telling myself this was just a practical arrangement," he said. "That you were here to cook and keep house and I was grateful for the help. But that's not true anymore, is it?" Rachel felt her pulse quicken at the vulnerability in his voice. "No," she said softly. "It's not. The thing is," Michael continued, "I never thought I'd want to care about someone again after Sarah died. I thought that part of my life was over, that the best I could hope for was getting through each day without falling apart completely." "And now?" Rachel asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Now I find myself looking forward to coming home," Michael said. "Looking forward to seeing your face across the breakfast table, to talking about our days, to feeling like this old house is alive again instead of just a place where I happen to sleep." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes at his words. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "I came here planning to hide from life, to find a place where I could just exist without having to pretend I was okay. But instead, I found reasons to want to be okay again." Michael reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand in his larger, warmer one. "So where does that leave us?" "I don't know," Rachel said honestly. "I'm scared, Michael, scared of caring about someone again, scared of the possibility of losing someone else I love." "I'm scared too," Michael admitted, "but I'm more scared of letting fear keep me from something that might be wonderful." They sat together in the cold night air, hands joined and hearts cautiously opening to possibilities neither had dared imagine just weeks before. Hope stirred in Rachel's lap, making a soft sound of contentment that seemed to echo their own tentative peace. "Diana wants more than a business partnership," Rachel said eventually, needing to voice the concern that had been nagging at her all evening. "I know," Michael said, "but what Diana wants isn't what I want. Not anymore." "What do you want?" Rachel asked. Michael was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "I want morning coffee and burnt biscuits," he said. "I want to come home to the smell of dinner cooking and someone who cares if I make it back safely from the north pasture. I want to teach you about cattle and learn about cooking from you." I want to watch Hope grow up and see what kind of goat she becomes. Rachel felt her heart swell at his simple, heartfelt words. Those are good things to want, she said. What do you want, Rachel? Michael asked. I want to stop being afraid, she said. I want to wake up in the morning and think about the day ahead instead of the past I can't change. I want to cook for someone who appreciates it, to feel useful and needed and valued for who I am. You are all of those things, Michael said firmly, and more. They stayed on the porch until the cold finally drove them inside, but the awkwardness of earlier had disappeared, replaced by a tentative hope that felt both fragile and strong. As they said goodnight in the hallway, Michael paused at his bedroom door. Stay, he said quietly. If you try again, if you're willing to risk caring about someone new, stay. I know it's scary, and I know we both have reasons to be careful, but I think what we're building here is worth the risk. Rachel looked at him, seeing everything she'd been afraid to hope for reflected in his eyes. I'll stay, she said. If you'll have me, if you're willing to take a chance on someone who sometimes burns the biscuits and comes with a baby goat, I'll stay. Michael's smile was radiant in the dim hallway light. Burnt biscuits and baby goats included, he said. I wouldn't have it any other way. As they parted for the night, Rachel felt something settle in her chest that she'd thought was lost forever. Not the naive happiness of her earlier life, but something deeper and more resilient. The possibility of love after loss, of building something new while honoring what came before, of finding home in unexpected places with unexpected people. In her room, as she settled Hope in her bed and prepared for sleep, Rachel looked out at the vast Texas sky and whispered a quiet thank you to whatever force had led her to this place, to this man, to this second chance at life and love. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.